All right, so in this first video on our series on the scientific revolution, we are going to kind of cover the background and the context for why the scientific revolution started. So before we get into the actual science stuff, it does kind of bear mentioning that science, as we know science, didn't really exist until maybe the 1700s. Up until this point, what we thought of as science was better known as natural philosophy. And it wasn't done by scientists, it was done by philosophers. So there really wasn't any idea of a scientist until around the 1700s. So around this time that we're talking about, there really wasn't a concept of science, and there really wasn't a concept of a scientist. Natural philosophy was done by philosophers. And so when we think about some of the very earliest contributors to what we think of as science, we have to go back to people like Aristotle, like Plato and Aristotle. Served as the foundation for science, or at least natural philosophy. So when we think about what natural philosophy is like explaining how the natural world works. And so for someone like Aristotle, Aristotelian logic simply says something like, if it's logical and makes sense, then it's true. But that's not necessarily always the case. So if something is logical and makes sense, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily true. It just means that it's logical. So another name that we should probably think about, because he's going to be important for when we talk about medicine, is this guy named Galen. So Galen was a 3rd century, so he's working in the 200s. He was a 3rd century Greek, I guess you could call him a physician, and philosopher. And his work was really groundbreaking in the 3rd century, but his work really went unchallenged until like the 1700s, until the 16th century. So for almost 1500 years, medicine did not change. So basically, what Galen said was that illness came through an imbalance in the humors. And so your body is made up of the 4 humors. And these are blood, phlegm, I think I spelled phlegm right. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. That's what's in your body. Blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. And they're supposed to be balanced. Any imbalance causes disease. So if you are sick, it is because one of these things has become unbalanced. So, for example, if you have a fever, you have too much blood. According to Galen. Of course, that's not why you have a fever. If you have a fever, it's because you have some sort of an infection and your body is raising its temperature in order to kill off the thing that is making you sick. But they didn't think that way. They thought you had too much blood. Now let's think about blood for a second. Blood is red, blood is warm. Therefore, too much blood makes you too warm, which is what a fever is. So the solution to having a fever is to bleed a patient. Just cut them open and let them bleed. It makes logical sense, but it's not true. And any cases in which someone got better as a result of bleeding were a coincidence. But there were enough that no one questioned this. Because normally, if you have a fever, it's not hard to get over that. Most people are going to get over a fever on their own. And so people were bled and they got better, so they obviously think that bleeding makes you better, when that's not necessarily the case. So this is the scientific, background or context that we're dealing with when we start thinking about science in the 1700s. So the next question is, why is this happening? Why is there now a shift in how we're thinking about science? So one of the reasons that this happens is that the Renaissance used books brought back from the Middle East via trade or the Crusades. And a lot of these books that they brought back from the Middle East were written in Greek, not Latin. And what they discovered that when the Greek books were translated, they said something different. They said something different than the books that were written in Latin. So now the question is, which is true? And when we're talking about these books, these are like science books, books about medicine, usually. But then they have to figure out, well, which one of these books is true? Is it the book written in Greek or is it the book written in Latin? And so to figure it out, they have to actually like do science, for lack of a better term, to determine which one is right. So for the first time in a really long time, we're starting to question the foundational ideas. Now, for science, it's these scientific ideas, but we're already kind of thinking about, well, are these ideas that we've based our entire society on true? Are these things that we've been thinking that are true actually true? So it kind of gets the mind in a mode to question things. Another reason why this starts to happen is that a lot of Renaissance art requires close examination of the human body and how it moves. Which, I mean, if you're kind of thinking about this scientifically, this is basically anatomy. Like they're trying to figure out how the body moves, why the body moves the way it does. And so a lot of early Renaissance artists started the process of learning anatomy. Sometimes we needed new technologies to look at this stuff. So, for example, maybe the microscope, maybe the telescope. These are things that we might need to use in order to get a close examination of nature. And then finally, to dust off an old idea, the idea of humanism. It's good for people to kind of examine the natural world. The idea of free will to explore God's creation. Like all of these ideas, going back to like the Crusades, but Renaissance art, humanism, all of these things are kind of opening a door that we opened a little bit when we thought about the Renaissance. But now it's being opened even wider to think, well, it's not just about art and it's not just about what I do with my daily life, it's about the entirety of the world. So now we have to examine everything, or at least we can examine everything. Whether or not we should is a different question that we'll worry about later. The last thing I want to spend a little bit of time on in this video is the kind of pre-scientific view of astronomy, because we're going to spend quite a bit of time in our next video looking at astronomy. So since we're kind of spending this video looking at how things used to be and why we're starting to think about science, it's a good idea for us to take a closer look at how people viewed the universe in a church-approved way. So this view of astronomy, this is the church-approved description of the universe. This is how the church viewed the universe to be. Now, this church-approved description comes from a Greek astronomer / philosopher named Ptolemy. And so this model of the universe is known as the Ptolemaic model. This Ptolemaic model is also known as a geocentric model. Geocentric meaning Earth in the middle. So here's what the geocentric model looks like. So in the center is the Earth, unmoving. It does not move. It is unmoving, and it is made up of combinations of the 4 elements. So the 4 elements, of course, earth, air, water, and fire. And of course, the earth is in the center because the earth and humans are God's perfect creation. So why wouldn't they be right in the middle? God wants to show off, so his most perfect creation is right there in the middle. Above the earth which is not a planet, there are 10 perfectly round spheres made of non-Earth material. Basically the stuff that's made of, like that heaven is made of. So I think the word that's used is quintessence. There are 10 perfectly round spheres above the earth made of a non-earth material. Think like what heaven must be made of. That's called quintessence. These 10 perfectly round spheres move in perfectly circular orbits. So there are the 7 planets. So the 7 planets, let's see if I can name them all without looking. So we've got the Sun, the Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Those are the things you can see with the naked eye. So the Sun, the Moon, the Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. There is one planet with the stars, one planet that is the star mover, and then there is one quote unquote prime mover, which moves everything else. So those are your 10 perfectly round spheres. Beyond this is heaven. So it's nice to know where it is. Even if you can't get there, that's where it is. So it's outside of these 10 planets. That's where heaven is. Now, here's the thing, and this is where we'll end for today. Astronomers noted that the planets and the stars don't move like they should if this was actually how things worked. So if the Earth was in the middle of this system, the stars should move in a certain way. The planets should move in a certain way. And what astronomers are starting to notice is that the stars don't move the way they should. The planets don't move the way they should if this was the case. And so what we'll look at in the next video is how astronomers kind of pick this system apart piece by piece. So that's where we will stop here. We'll pick this up in our next video where we look at the actual contributions of early astronomers. So until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.